People think the cartel's biggest problem is getting past the border. Checkpoints, agents, dogs and cameras are supposed to stop them, but the people on this list were already inside the system when they chose the other side. Sheriffs, soldiers, and informants helped cartels operate from within. These are 10 American officials who betrayed the very system they were supposed to protect. Section 1. Margarita Crispin. At her checkpoint in El Paso, Texas, Margarita Crispin had a habit of waving the drug-sniffing dogs away from her lane. She told colleagues she was frightened of them. She said it often enough that people accepted it, that it became a piece of routine workplace knowledge, a quirk logged alongside 1,000 other quirks in a large federal agency where officers rotate through long shifts and know each other well enough to give ground on small things. When federal investigators looked closer, they found something worth noting. Margarita Crispin had dogs at home. She had been working at the El Paso port of entry since 2003, assigned to inspect vehicles crossing from Ciudad Juarez into Texas on one of the busiest land crossings on the entire United States-Mexico border. The El Paso crossing is not a remote outpost. Tens of thousands of vehicles pass through in a given week, carrying commercial cargo, daily commuters, and the kind of ordinary cross-border traffic that makes thorough inspection of every vehicle functionally impossible. A CBP officer working a lane has a limited number of seconds to assess each car, ask a question, check documents, decide. Most vehicles get a glance. Only the ones that trigger something get pulled into secondary inspection for a more thorough look. That volume is both a logistical reality and, from the perspective of a drug trafficking organization, a structural advantage. The cartel's basic business model at a crossing like El Paso depends on keeping their loads in lanes that don't flag anything. Margarita Crispin made that easier. What investigators ultimately pieced together was a relationship that had started well before she ever put on the badge. Federal investigators from the Department of Homeland Security concluded that Crispin had likely been recruited by a friend with connections to the Juarez cartel before she applied for the position at CBP. That detail deserves careful attention because it reframes the entire case. The standard image of border corruption involves a person who takes a job legitimately, holds it for some time, and then gets approached by traffickers looking for a weak point inside the agency. That model does happen. The Crispin case points towards something different. A model the cartels had already begun developing by the early 2000s. Identify candidates before they are hired, cultivate the relationship through the application and training process, and have an asset in place from the moment they report for duty. A person positioned inside an agency from the first day of employment is a categorically different problem than a person who turned corrupt somewhere along the way. The prevention strategies required to address each category are entirely distinct. Crispin belonged to the harder one. Almost immediately after finishing her training and receiving her credentials, she began helping traffickers move loads through her lane. The mechanics were straightforward. She received advance notice of which vehicles to expect. She knew the make, the approximate arrival time, what to let through without a thorough inspection. When the vehicle reached her lane, she cleared it. She kept the dogs away with a story about being frightened. The vehicles passed. The drugs inside them crossed into the United States. The money moved in the other direction. What she received in total for that service became one of the more striking figures to come out of the case. FBI officials who reviewed the investigation concluded that Crispin had been paid approximately $5 million over the course of her time at the checkpoint. That figure was stated publicly by the Assistant Director of the FBI's Criminal Investigative Division when the case became widely known, and the number carried weight precisely because it had been calculated, not loosely estimated. $5 million. For a CBP officer waving drug loads through a lane in El Paso over a period of roughly 4 years. That figure becomes clearer when considered against what was actually at stake on each crossing. Her salary as a federal officer was what a mid-level government employee earns in a working American city. $5 million was a separate career, running alongside the legitimate one, generating money on a scale the legitimate one could never approach. The Juarez cartel understood the math exactly. At the time Crispin was working the checkpoint, the cartel controlled one of the most valuable smuggling corridors in North America. The El Paso-Ciudad Juarez crossing handled enormous commercial and personal traffic, and the organization's ability to push cocaine, marijuana, and other narcotics through that corridor reliably and at volume was worth far more than any individual officer's salary. A single marijuana shipment of several hundred pounds moving through that crossing and on toward distribution points deeper in the interior of the country carried a street value that ran well into the millions. Paying one officer $5 million over 4 years to guarantee reliable access to a lane at that crossing was a rational business calculation. The cartel was not being generous. It was buying certainty. The return on that investment, measured in loads successfully delivered, dwarfed the cost many times over. By the time federal investigators moved to arrest her in July 2007, Crispin had let more than 2,200 pounds of marijuana cross through her lane. That figure comes from what investigators believed they could verify and document. It does not account for anything that moved through her lane in intervals between documented incidents, or for vehicles that were never successfully connected to her operation after the fact. The gap between what can be proven in a federal case and what actually happened over the course of 4 years at a major border crossing is not a small gap. Investigators work with what they can recover. What they recovered here was enough. The nature of her relationships on the cartel side of the arrangement was also notable. Her connections were not a single clean relationship with one handler. They developed through a succession of personal associations, a friend with cartel ties before she was hired, and then a series of boyfriends and associates who maintained links to the major trafficking organizations operating out of Ciudad Juarez. The Juarez cartel had deep roots in the urban fabric of the city directly across the river from El Paso. Its leadership, its logistics networks, and its personnel were embedded in Juarez in ways that made maintaining operational contacts on the American side of the border a routine organizational requirement rather than an exceptional maneuver. For the cartel, Crispin was an asset to be managed like any other. She was identified, cultivated, compensated, and maintained in the same way the organization handled any resource that served its supply chain. How she managed the practical details of the operation for as long as she did is a question worth taking seriously. 4 years is a significant run for a corrupt officer at a federal checkpoint, particularly in the environment that followed September 2001, when attention to border security had intensified across every agency involved in it. Part of the answer lies in the structure of a busy port of entry operating under sustained pressure. Supervisors cannot monitor every lane at every moment. The volume of daily traffic creates constant operational pressure that keeps attention on throughput, on keeping vehicles moving, on managing the flow. A single officer who develops a habit of keeping the dogs away from her lane, a single officer who processes certain vehicles quickly and moves them through without flagging anything for secondary inspection, does not necessarily surface as an anomaly in the noise of a day that involves thousands of crossings. The deviation has to accumulate to a visible degree, or someone has to notice it and decide to act on it. For 4 years, neither happened. There is also the question of what it takes to keep a secret of that scale in a workplace. The cartel side of the operation required coordination. Someone on the Mexican side needed to know Crispin's schedule, her lane assignment, the timing of her shifts. Someone needed to communicate which vehicles were coming through and when. That kind of coordination leaves traces, phone records, financial movements, patterns in crossing data. Building a case from those traces took time. The FBI's involvement in the investigation, rather than relying solely on CBP's internal affairs apparatus, indicated the seriousness of the operation. The scale of the payments, the duration of the arrangement, and the suspected depth of the cartel connection made it something that warranted interagency resources. By the time investigators moved on her in July 2007, the documentation was substantial. Crispin did not fight the case at length. In April 2008, she pleaded guilty. The evidence against her was extensive and had been assembled carefully over a long investigation. Federal prosecutors, in major corruption cases, operate with tools that make a prolonged legal fight extremely costly for the defendant, particularly when the financial trail, the pattern of lame behavior, and the personal relationship history have all been documented thoroughly. The plea carried a sentence of 20 years in federal prison. 20 years is the number most often attached to the Crispin case. It is worth pausing on what those two numbers, the sentence and the payment, say when placed next to each other. She entered federal employment in 2003 with a badge and a lane and the legal authority of a CBP officer. She used that authority from the beginning to generate revenue for a drug trafficking organization operating out of the city directly across the river. Over roughly 4 years, the government calculated her earnings from that arrangement at $5 million. The sentence was 20 years. Those figures describe the economics of federal corruption at a busy border crossing in a way that policy language rarely manages. The Crispin case surfaced repeatedly in congressional testimony in the years following her conviction, cited specifically as an example of what pre-employment cartel recruitment looked like in practice. Federal officials appearing before Senate committees discussed it as representative of a category of risk the agency had not yet fully developed procedures to address. They described a pattern in which trafficking organizations had begun treating the CBP hiring pipeline as a targeting environment, identifying candidates who could be turned into long-term assets before background checks and training ever began. The resources available to an organization like the Juarez Cartel and the financial rewards available to an officer willing to cooperate created an imbalance that standard vetting procedures were slow to close. Crispin was not the only officer to emerge from that process. She became the documented example, the case that went before lawmakers as evidence that the threat was real and that it had already been inside the agency, working a lane, keeping the dogs away, for years before anyone moved to stop it. The dog story is the part that stays, not because it is the most consequential detail in the case, but because of what it reveals about how the corruption was maintained at the operational level. The mechanism she used was not technical or sophisticated. It was human. It relied on a workplace culture where small personal quirks go unquestioned, where colleagues accommodate each other's stated fears without demanding verification, where the daily pressure of processing thousands of vehicles leaves little bandwidth for scrutiny of the person working the next lane over. She told people she was scared of dogs. People believed her. The loads kept moving through her lane for 4 years. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Crispin's operation ran on a simple principle. The cartel didn't find her after she got the job. It placed her there before her first day. The next case begins with a different kind of family loyalty and a headless body washing up off South Padre Island. Section 2. Joel Luna. The body of Jose Francisco Palacios Paz surfaced in the waters off South Padre Island in March 2015, at the height of spring break, in one of the most photographed stretches of coastline in Texas. It was naked, and it was missing its head. Investigators traced him back to an Edinburgh tire shop, and from the tire shop to 3 brothers, and from the 3 brothers to a story that reached across the Rio Grande into the organizational structure of the Gulf Cartel. One of those brothers was a United States Border Patrol agent stationed at a checkpoint in Hebronville, Texas. His name was Joel Luna. Joel Luna was 31 years old when the investigation caught up with him. By any conventional measure of a public servant's biography, the record looked good. He had served in Iraq, earned decorations for that service, returned home, and joined the Border Patrol. He was fluent in English, positioned at an interior checkpoint well north of the actual border, and had built a career in federal law enforcement that gave him access, credibility, and the kind of institutional standing that was difficult to connect, at a surface level, to the organization his youngest brother was allegedly working for on the other side of the river. That gap between surface and reality is the central architecture of the Joel Luna case. The mechanics of what prosecutors alleged were divided along the same lines as the family itself. Eduardo Luna, the youngest of the three brothers, was identified in court documents as a Gulf cartel commander operating out of Reynosa, Mexico. His cartel nickname was El Pájaro, the bird. He was 25 years old when the case went to trial. Fernando Luna, the oldest of the three, worked at the Edinburgh tire shop alongside Eduardo and functioned in the middle layer of what prosecutors described as an international drug and gun trafficking operation. Joel, the middle brother and the one with the American badge and the federal paycheck, was characterized by the prosecution as the organization's American-facing partner, using his fluency, his legal status, and his law enforcement connections to manage the operation's presence on the United States side of the border. The guns allegedly moved south. The drugs and the money allegedly moved north. Joel Luna's role, prosecutors argued, was to call the shots in a language and a legal environment that his Mexican-born brothers could not navigate on their own. Eduardo Luna had a gun in his name when investigators found it. They recovered it from a black safe that prosecutors connected to Joel, a safe that had been moved from Joel's house to his mother-in-law's house in 2015 as the investigation began closing in. Inside the safe were drugs, cash, and paperwork. There was also Joel Luna's commemorative Border Patrol badge and the password to his workstation at the Hebronville checkpoint. And there was the pistol, a gold-plated .38 Super, a model closely associated in the borderlands with cartel culture and with the kind of self-presentation that functions as organizational currency inside those networks. On one side of the weapon was the phrase Cartel del Golfo. On the handle, stamped into the grip, was the word Pájaro, Eduardo's name inside the organization, on a gun kept in a safe connected to his Border Patrol agent brother. Prosecutors held it up during closing arguments. The lead prosecutor called it a sicario's gun. He was not wrong about the model or its associations. The victim at the center of the case was Frankie Palacios, a Honduran immigrant who had been connected to the Luna brothers' operations and who, investigators believed, had come to know enough about the drug trafficking enterprise to become a liability. The cartel's logic in these situations is not complicated and does not require a great deal of deliberation at the top. Someone who knows too much about the organization's operations, its roots, its personnel, and its revenue streams represents a specific category of risk. That risk is eliminated. The body is disposed of in a way that sends a message or in a way that delays identification. Palacios received the former treatment. His headless body was found in Laguna Madre Bay during one of the most heavily trafficked tourist periods on the South Texas coast. That choice of location and timing is not accidental in cartel violence. It is a communication. Fernando Luna, the oldest brother, became the prosecution's most important witness. He cut a deal before trial, pleading guilty to a single cocaine possession charge in exchange for the dismissal of the far more serious counts he had been facing, including capital murder. He agreed to debrief fully with state prosecutors and to testify against his two brothers. Standing in court and speaking through an interpreter, Fernando described the events at the tire shop and the conversation he had with Joel after the murder. He told the court that Joel had inquired about whether bloodstains had been left at the scene. That detail, a question about crime scene evidence from a man who was a federal law enforcement officer at the time of the murder, became one of the prosecution's most contested pieces of evidence. Joel's attorney argued it proved nothing. Prosecutors argued it indicated a man who already knew what had happened and was managing the fallout. Joel was working his shift at the Hebronville checkpoint on the day Palacios was killed. He was not at the tire shop. He was not present at the killing. The prosecution's case against him rested on what Texas law calls the law of parties, which holds that a defendant who participates in a common criminal enterprise can be held accountable for crimes committed by co-conspirators in furtherance of that enterprise, even if the defendant was not physically present when those crimes occurred. The law of parties is the standard vehicle for prosecuting criminal organization leadership in cases where the person directing an operation insulates themselves from the actual violence by keeping their hands clean and their location documented. Prosecutors argued that Joel Luna's role in the organization, the money he was connected to, the safe with the badge and the password and the cartel pistol, the question about bloodstains, the pattern of smuggling that the brothers had operated together, all of it placed him inside the criminal enterprise that produced Palacios's murder. The jury worked through 2 weeks of testimony and took time with their deliberations. They came back with a split verdict. On the capital murder charge, they acquitted Joel Luna. On 2 counts of engaging in organized criminal activity, covering his participation in the drug and gun trafficking operation, they convicted him. The distinction mattered enormously in sentencing terms. Capital murder in Texas carries a maximum of life without parole. Engaging in organized criminal activity, while still a serious felony, is a different category. Prosecutors and the defense reached an agreement, 20 years, in exchange for no appeals. The defense made that calculation, knowing that Joel had already been found guilty of running organized criminal activity with a Gulf cartel hitman for a brother, that the safe with his badge and the cartel pistol had been photographed and entered into evidence, and that an appeal was unlikely to produce a better outcome. He accepted 20 years. Eduardo Luna did not have the benefit of a split verdict or a negotiated sentence. The jury convicted him on all 4 counts, including capital murder for retaliation, which carried a mandatory sentence. He received life in prison without the possibility of parole. He was 26 years old, the youngest brother, the one the prosecution described as capable of killing anyone without reason, the one whose nickname was stamped into the grip of a gold-plated cartel weapon kept in his Border Patrol agent brother's safe, would not leave prison. What makes the Joel Luna case significant within the broader record of Border Patrol corruption is not simply that an agent was convicted of criminal activity. That happened before Joel Luna, and it has happened since. What makes it significant is the nature of the entanglement. Joel Luna was not a man who got a job in federal law enforcement and was then approached by strangers with money. His family was the organization. His youngest brother was a cartel commander operating out of Reynosa. The smuggling operation that prosecutors laid out was a family enterprise running across the international border, using the formal division between Joel's American credentials and his brother's Mexican cartel connections as a structural feature of the operation itself. Joel's badge did not keep the cartel out. From the prosecution's perspective, it was part of the operation's infrastructure. The question of how deep Joel's involvement ran, beyond what the jury decided and what the evidence established in court, is one that prosecutors and investigators answered differently than the jury did on the murder count. The prosecution's portrait was of a man who ran the American end of an international trafficking network and who knew exactly what happened to Frankie Palacios because he was part of the organization that decided it. The defense's portrait was of a man who made the serious mistake of giving shelter and support to family members who were involved in things he did not fully understand, who was not present at the murder and could not be proven to have ordered it. The jury's verdict split the difference in a way that was legally possible, but that left each side able to claim partial vindication. The safe remains the most difficult element for the defense's portrait to absorb, It is possible to argue that a man did not know his brother was a cartel hitman. It is harder to argue that a man did not know what was in a safe he had kept at his own residence and later had moved to a relative's home when a federal investigation was underway. The safe contained his commemorative Border Patrol badge. It contained the password to his federal workstation. It contained drugs, cash, documents, and a gold-plated pistol with the Gulf Cartel's name on one side and his cartel commander brother's nickname on the other. A person unaware of what his brothers were doing does not ordinarily store organizational weapons alongside his official law enforcement credentials. The case surfaced a pattern that investigators working border corruption had been tracking for years: the problem of family-based penetration of federal border enforcement agencies. The Luna situation was an extreme version, involving a sitting cartel commander as a direct family member of a serving federal agent, but the broader dynamic it represented was not unique. The cartel's operations depend on networks of trust built through existing relationships. Family is the original trust network. An agent whose family members are cartel connected is not simply a person with unfortunate relatives. From the cartel's perspective, that agent is a potential asset who comes preloaded with the most reliable form of leverage available: the obligations, loyalties, and shared knowledge that only family creates. The management challenge for CBP and Border Patrol is that those family connections are often impossible to fully trace during background investigations, particularly when cartel members operate under assumed identities, maintain legitimate covers, or are based in Mexico, where American investigative reach is constrained. Joel Luna's case came to trial in January 2017. The conviction and sentencing drew significant coverage in South Texas media and in outlets tracking border security. The verdict arrived as a complicated outcome, not a clean resolution. An agent convicted of running organized crime with his Gulf Cartel brothers, acquitted of the murder that came out of that organization, sentenced to 20 years, while his cartel commander brother received life without parole. The split verdict captured something real about the difficulty of prosecuting criminal conspiracy at the organizational level, where the person insulated from the violence by their legitimate employment and their American credentials can be genuinely hard to connect, beyond reasonable doubt, to the specific acts of violence the organization produces. Frankie Palacios, the man whose headless body floated to the surface off South Padre Island in March 2015, was a Honduran immigrant who had gotten close enough to the Luna brothers' operation to be considered a threat. The manner of his death, the location of his disposal, the timing during spring break on one of the most visible stretches of the Texas Gulf Coast reflected the cartel's habit of making consequences visible as a management tool. The message was not aimed at the American public or at law enforcement. It was aimed at anyone in the organization's extended network who might be considering whether cooperation with authorities was a viable option. Palacios apparently had been seen as someone who might be moving in that direction. The safe with the cartel pistol and the Border Patrol badge sat at a mother-in-law's house in Texas while the investigation ran. The middle brother worked his shift at the Hebronville checkpoint. The oldest brother eventually testified in court, in Spanish, through an interpreter, about the conversations that followed. The youngest brother, El Pájaro, got life without parole at 26. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case involves a man who brought none of that family complexity with him. He just needed the money, and he had a nickname, and the system he worked inside gave him everything he required to operate for years. Section 3. Leonard Darnell, George. On Valentine's Day 2022, Leonard Darnell George drove a 2020 Cadillac CT5 across the border into Ensenada, Mexico, and handed it to an associate of the drug trafficking organization he had been working for since the previous autumn. He had bought the car himself, with money received the day before as payment for a drug run he had facilitated at his lane at the San Diego port of entry. The money came in, the car went out, and George made the drive to Ensenada and handed over the keys. He was, at that moment, still an active United States Customs and Border Protection officer. He had a lane assignment. He had a badge. He had a federal salary and a uniform that one of his trafficking associates had recently borrowed long enough to take a selfie in. The Cadillac was not an extravagance on the margins of a crime. It was a business transaction, delivered on a holiday by a man who had turned his checkpoint lane into a service that charged by the vehicle. George worked at the San Diego port of entry, one of the highest volume land crossings in the world, where the volume of daily traffic creates exactly the kind of operational cover that drug trafficking organizations spend considerable resources identifying and exploiting. He had a nickname inside the network that eventually employed him. They called him the goalie. The name carried a meaning that was not subtle. A goalie in the context of a checkpoint is not someone who stops things. It is someone positioned at the final point of passage who makes sure that what needs to get through, gets through. The cartel's language for their assets inside law enforcement tends to be functional rather than sentimental. The goalie was a description of a job. George's job, from the perspective of the organizations paying him, was to be the last gate that opened on demand. He began accepting bribes in approximately October 2021, according to the federal indictment unsealed in July 2023. The arrangement had a structure that reflected how thoroughly the trafficking organizations had worked out the logistics of running a corrupt officer at a busy crossing. George would notify his contacts in the organization when he reported to work. He told them what lane he had been assigned. He gave them a 1-hour window. Get the vehicle to his lane within 60 minutes of his notification, and it would pass without inspection. Outside that window, he could not guarantee what would happen because lane assignments shift and inspection protocols are not entirely within any single officer's control. Inside the window, the load vehicle would move through without interference. That was the product he was selling, and the organizations buying it understood its value precisely because they understood how the crossing worked. The 1-hour window was not an inconvenience. It was a feature. It meant the load vehicle did not have to linger in the approach lanes, did not have to sit in traffic near the crossing longer than necessary, did not have to be in a position where it might attract attention before reaching George's lane. The logistics were tight because the organizations had made them tight. What he was letting through was not small. Federal prosecutors established at trial that George facilitated at least 19 crossings between late 2021 and June 2022. The vehicles carried several hundred pounds of methamphetamine across those crossings, along with smaller quantities of cocaine, fentanyl, and heroin. The methamphetamine was the primary cargo by weight. A single load of 222 pounds of methamphetamine came through in February 2022, a crossing that produced one of the most revealing sequences in the entire case. On that day, law enforcement had placed an alert on a suspected drug smuggling vehicle. The vehicle entered George's lane. Because the alert was already in the system, George had no choice but to send it to secondary inspection, where the 222 pounds were found and seized. An ordinary person in George's position, a person maintaining even a minimal instinct for self-preservation, would have treated that moment as a crisis. The load was in secondary. Agents were going through the vehicle. The organization that had paid him to let the vehicle through had just watched their load get seized at his lane. The obvious response, from a risk management perspective, was to go quiet, to stop, to let some time pass before any further contact with the organization. George allowed the vehicle directly behind the flagged car to pass through his lane and into the United States. That second vehicle was affiliated with the same trafficking organization and was carrying more than 200 pounds of drugs. It had been traveling directly behind the seized load. He received approximately $13,000 for that vehicle the following day and used a portion of that money to buy a Cadillac for a trafficking associate. The sequence: a seized load followed immediately by a second load passing through the same lane, followed by a payment and a luxury car purchased the next morning and driven to Mexico on Valentine's Day, is not the behavior of a man who was frightened or confused about what he was doing. It is the behavior of someone who had assessed the risk and decided that the business continued. He was working simultaneously for two separate criminal organizations, a fact that emerged at trial and that added a layer to the portrait that pure financial desperation does not fully explain. Running a corrupt operation inside a federal agency is inherently dangerous. Running one for two separate organizations at the same time, organizations that may not have known about each other's arrangement with the same officer, is a more aggressive version of that risk. George was not passively accepting money from a single contact who had identified him as an asset. He had positioned himself as a service provider with multiple clients. The goalie was an independent operation with a lane, a schedule, and a rate card. The pricing structure recovered from the investigation reflected that approach. He charged approximately $13,000 per vehicle as the base rate, a figure established through text messages and financial transactions that investigators recovered and presented at trial. Reports from the investigation also cited figures as high as $68,000 for multiple vehicle crossings bundled together, which suggests that at some points, the arrangement involved pre-booking several crossings at once rather than individual transactions negotiated vehicle by vehicle. 19 confirmed crossings at rates in that range represent a substantial sum of money accumulated in a period of roughly 8 months. The Cadillac was not an aberration. It was one piece of a financial life that had separated almost entirely from his federal salary. The text messages were central to how the government built its case. George communicated with members of the trafficking organizations through his phone, sending messages that confirmed his schedule, his lane assignment, and the outcomes of specific crossings. On the day after the February 2022 incident, the messages showed the confirmation of his $13,000 payment. In the world of federal corruption prosecutions, text messages of that kind are a prosecutor's most reliable tool because they document not just the act, but the mental state behind it, the casual transactional language of a business relationship that has been going on long enough that neither party feels the need to be indirect. George's messages were not coded with particular sophistication. They reflected a man who had been doing this long enough that the communications felt routine. Among the evidence that came out at trial was something more visceral than financial records. One of George's trafficking associates had at some point borrowed his CBP uniform jacket and taken a selfie wearing it. That photograph was entered into evidence. The image of a drug trafficking organization associate posing in the jacket of the law enforcement officer he was paying to move his product carries a specific kind of weight. It is not just evidence of a crime. It is documentation of contempt for the institution the jacket was supposed to represent, preserved digitally, available for federal prosecutors to present to a jury. What made the photograph possible was not audacity alone. It was the depth of the relationship. You don't borrow a federal officer's uniform jacket for a photograph unless the relationship between you has moved well past the formal transactional stage into something more comfortable and more reckless. Before the drug charges materialized publicly, there had been prior incidents involving George that had come to the attention of CBP and local authorities. On May 6th of a prior year, George had alerted a supervisor to self-harm concerns, prompting the San Diego police to detain him on a mental health hold. His firearms were seized as a result, and a gun violence restraining order was sought against him. He was placed on administrative leave for a period. A second incident, involving George and his brother, related to one of their frequent trips to Mexico, had also resulted in a period of administrative leave. The institutional response to those incidents, as later reviewed in the context of his indictment, raised questions about what the agency's internal processes had or had not identified during the period when George was already operating inside the trafficking network. CBP's position, consistent across these cases, was that it could not discuss the specifics of administrative actions involving personnel under investigation. What the timeline established was that the corruption was already underway during at least some portion of the period in which administrative actions were being taken and resolved. The indictment came down in July 2023. George was the lead defendant in a 7-person indictment, with the drug conspiracy charges bringing in additional defendants, including Mario Angel Gutierrez and Esteban Galvan. He was charged separately with receiving bribes as a public official and with possessing a firearm in furtherance of a drug trafficking crime. The bribery charge was specific to his role as an officer, using his official position to induce payment in exchange for not enforcing the laws he was employed to enforce. The firearm charge indicated an additional layer of involvement beyond the lane facilitation itself. He pleaded not guilty. The trial ran in the spring of 2024. Several witnesses testified about the mechanics of the arrangement. George's pattern of notifying the organization when he was at work and what lane he occupied was laid out in detail. The February 2022 incident with the 2 vehicles was presented in sequence, including the decision to let the second vehicle through immediately after the first was seized in secondary. The text messages confirming payments were entered into evidence. The photograph of the associate in George's CBP jacket was shown to the jury. The Cadillac purchase and the Valentine's Day drive to Ensenada were part of the record. On June 10, 2024, the jury convicted him. In November 2024, a federal judge sentenced Leonard Darnell George to 23 years in federal prison. The sentence reflected the quantity of drugs he had facilitated, the duration of the operation, the multiple organizations he had served simultaneously, the human smuggling that was wrapped into the same lane access he sold to drug traffickers, and the specific character of the February 2022 decision to let a second load through immediately after the first was caught. That decision was not a moment of weakness or miscalculation. It was a choice made in real time by someone who understood what was at stake and continued anyway. The sentencing judge and federal prosecutors both cited the severity of that conduct in the language surrounding the sentence. The U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of California, Tara McGrath, described what the jury's verdict represented in terms that went beyond George specifically. Trading in a badge for cash, in her framing, was a path to a criminal conviction. The language was intended partly as deterrence, directed at anyone inside law enforcement considering the same calculation. Whether deterrence of that kind reaches the people it is aimed at is a question that the volume of cases across the last 2 decades answers with some skepticism. George did not arrive at the San Diego port of entry in 2021 without having some awareness of what the consequences of getting caught would look like. The deterrence argument was already available to him as information. He proceeded anyway, for 8 months, across at least 19 crossings, for 2 separate organizations, at rates that generated enough income to purchase a luxury car as a gift and drive it to Mexico on a holiday. The nickname stayed in court documents, in press coverage, in the way investigators and prosecutors discussed the case publicly. Leonard Darnell George remained the goalie. The name had been given to him by the people who paid him, and it described his function accurately. He was positioned at the final gate of a legal border crossing, the point at which the entire infrastructure of customs inspection, canine units, secondary facilities, and federal enforcement authority was supposed to provide its definitive answer about what could enter the country. The goalie's answer, for 8 months, for 19 confirmed crossings, for 2 trafficking organizations, was that the gate was open, the window was 1 hour, and the rate was $13,000 per vehicle. He would notify them when he arrived at work. They should get the load to his lane before the hour ran out. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. George ran his operation out of one of the busiest crossings in the world, and charged a flat rate per vehicle for 8 months. The next case is set on a quieter stretch of highway in southern Arizona, where a 14-year Border Patrol veteran decided to collect $20,000 a load from contacts he never even met in person. Section 4. Jorge Jimenez. In the summer of 2024, a 14-year Border Patrol veteran named Jorge Jimenez was assigned to the Interstate 19 checkpoint south of Tucson, Arizona. Before a single load reached his lane, the coordinators in Mexico had already sent him a photograph of the vehicle, not a description or a plate number relayed over a call, but an actual image of the specific car coming through so he could identify it on approach and wave it through without inspection. By the time the vehicle arrived, the decision had already been made. His job was to make sure the last barrier on the route didn't function as one. Jimenez had been a Border Patrol agent since 2010. By the summer of 2024, when the arrangement with the coordinators in Mexico began, he had 14 years in the agency. He was 54 years old, a resident of Nogales, Arizona, a border city that sits directly across from Nogales, Sonora, and that has lived for decades with the particular texture of a community where the legal and the illegal economies of the border move through the same streets, the same neighborhoods, and sometimes the same families. His assignment to the I-19 checkpoint placed him roughly 50 miles north of that city, at an interior inspection point designed to catch what the actual border crossing had missed. The distinction between a port of entry and an interior checkpoint matters for understanding what the I-19 facility was supposed to do. A port of entry is where vehicles formally cross from Mexico into the United States, where officers conduct primary inspections and route suspicious vehicles to secondary. An interior checkpoint on a major highway functions as a second layer of enforcement for traffic that has already made it across. By the time a vehicle reaches the I-19 checkpoint traveling north on the interstate, it has already passed through the actual border. The checkpoint exists because a significant volume of drug loads and unauthorized migrants makes it through the ports of entry or crosses between them through the desert and then moves north on the major highway corridors. The I-19 checkpoint is a catch for what slipped through earlier. When Jimenez was assigned there between June 2024 and early October 2024, he was positioned at exactly that second layer, the point in the smuggling route where a load that had successfully crossed the border still faced one more institutional obstacle before reaching distribution networks deeper in Arizona and beyond. A corrupted officer at an interior checkpoint serves a different function than a corrupted officer at a port of entry. At a port of entry, the corrupt officer is the mechanism by which the load crosses into the United States in the first place. At an interior checkpoint, the corrupt officer is the insurance policy. The load is already in the country. What Jimenez was selling was the guarantee that the final enforcement layer before the highway opened up would not close around the trafficking organization's vehicles. For an organization moving cocaine north on Interstate 19, the checkpoint was the last meaningful risk point on the journey. Paying Jimenez to neutralize that risk was, from the organization's perspective, a straightforward calculation. A seized load, worth multiples of what they were paying him, was the alternative. The rate was approximately $20,000 per load, with payment to be delivered in Mexico. That last condition, payment across the border rather than on the American side, had a practical logic that went beyond simple preference. Receiving cash payments in Arizona as a federal law enforcement officer created exposure in a way that collecting money in Mexico did not, at least not from American law enforcement's perspective. Meeting a contact in Mexico to receive payment meant the financial transaction occurred outside the direct reach of the surveillance and financial monitoring tools that American investigators could deploy. It also meant that Jimenez was making regular trips south, maintaining in-person contact with the network he was working for in an environment where those contacts could communicate more freely. The structure of the payment arrangement was itself evidence of how thoroughly the coordinators had thought through the operational security of the relationship. The coordinators were the intermediary layer between Jimenez and whatever organization's cocaine was moving through the checkpoint. Court records described at least 2 individuals located in Mexico who managed the logistics on the cartel side of the arrangement. Their role was to handle the scheduling, to confirm the details of each load vehicle with Jimenez in advance, to receive his real-time intelligence about conditions at the checkpoint, and to manage the payment after each successful crossing. They were the interface between the American agent and the broader trafficking organization, a structure that served a familiar organizational purpose. The coordinator layer insulates the organization's leadership from direct contact with its American assets. If the asset gets caught, the coordinators take the exposure before the investigation can reach further up the chain. The coordinators, in turn, are buffered from the organization's actual command structure by their own operational distance. The agent at the checkpoint knows the coordinators. The coordinators know their immediate superiors. The connection from the checkpoint lane to the organization's top tier runs through enough intermediate steps that each person in the chain has limited knowledge of the full structure. What Jimenez gave the coordinators in exchange for $20,000 per load was more than simple lane access. He provided real-time information about conditions at the checkpoint before the load vehicle arrived. He told them whether drug-sniffing dogs were on duty. He communicated details about checkpoint activity that allowed the coordinators to time the load vehicle's approach with precision. On at least one occasion documented in court records, he sent a message after a vehicle cleared his lane, confirming that the drugs had gone through successfully. That confirmation was not operationally necessary from the organization's perspective. The vehicle was already clear. The message served a different purpose. It was the transaction receipt, the signal that the service had been delivered and that payment could be processed. The coordinators, according to communications recovered from Jimenez's phone, responded at one point by telling him they were all now playing together. The language was casual. It described a working relationship that had reached a level of comfort where operational communications were mixing with something closer to collegial acknowledgement. Between June and September 2024, Jimenez waved through at least 5 vehicles, carrying a total of 60 kilograms of cocaine. That figure, 60 kilograms across 5 confirmed loads, was what federal prosecutors were able to document and present at trial. It represented a fraction of the traffic Jimenez was positioned to facilitate over a 4-month assignment at the checkpoint. 5 confirmed loads with 60 kilograms is a floor, not a ceiling. The total amount of cocaine that moved through the I-19 checkpoint during Jimenez's assignment while his arrangement with the coordinators was active is not a number that the conviction established with precision. What the conviction established was what the evidence could prove, which was 5 loads, 60 kilos, and approximately $20,000 per crossing expected in payment. The operation ended in October 2024, when Border Patrol removed Jimenez from the checkpoint, after undercover agents passing through documented that he was not asking the standard questions of drivers of vehicles suspected of carrying drugs. An undercover operation of that kind, placing federal agents in the role of ordinary travelers moving through the checkpoint, requires the kind of patience and coordination that reflects an investigation that has already developed substantial evidence and is looking to build the final layer. By the time the undercover agents documented Jimenez's behavior at the lane, investigators had already been building their case. The cell phone search that followed his removal from the checkpoint recovered the communications with the coordinators, the photographs of the load vehicles, and the pattern of messaging that laid the structure of the arrangement out in recoverable form. He was charged with conspiracy to commit honest services wire fraud, a federal charge that applies when a public official uses their position to deprive the public of their honest services, which is to say, their faithful performance of the duties their position requires. The charge is a standard vehicle for prosecuting public corruption cases at the federal level because it captures the essential nature of what a corrupt official does. They accept value in exchange for failing to perform the functions the public expects them to perform. Jimenez was a Border Patrol agent assigned to a checkpoint on a major highway. The public's interest in that assignment was straightforward. Vehicles carrying cocaine should not clear his lane because he had been paid to let them through. The conspiracy charge named the coordinators in Mexico as the co-conspirators, reflecting the documented relationship between Jimenez and the people who managed the cartel side of the arrangement. The trial ran for 10 days. The government presented the cell phone communications, the confirmation messages, the real-time intelligence Jimenez had passed to the coordinators before and after each load, and the testimony connecting the specific vehicles to specific crossings. Jimenez's defense contested the government's interpretation of the evidence, but the jury convicted him of conspiracy to commit honest services wire fraud. After deliberating, he was found guilty in April 2025. On October 30th, 2025, United States District Judge Rosemary Marquez sentenced Jorge Jimenez to 78 months in federal custody, a fine of $15,000, and a special assessment of $100. 78 months is 6.5 years. He was 54 at sentencing. He had joined the Border Patrol in 2010 and spent 14 years in the agency before the 4-month arrangement with the coordinators in Mexico ended it and replaced it with a federal conviction and a prison term that would occupy the remainder of his mid-50s and into his early 60s. The United States Attorney for the District of Arizona, Timothy Corchain, characterized the case in terms that the Department of Justice uses consistently across border corruption prosecutions, that the rare agent who takes cartel money betrays the institution and the many agents who serve with integrity. That framing is both accurate in its description of the majority and incomplete as an analysis of why the minority acts as they do. Jimenez was not a newly hired agent without institutional roots. He had 14 years of service. He was 54 years old. He knew how checkpoints worked because he had been working them for a significant portion of his adult life. He understood what the dogs were there to detect, what secondary inspection involved, what the cell phone communications he was sending could look like in a federal investigation, and what the consequences of being caught would mean for his career, his freedom, and everything attached to them. He proceeded anyway, across a 4-month period, for 60 kilograms of documented cocaine and an expected payment of approximately $20,000 per load. The I-19 checkpoint itself is a specific kind of environment. It sits on a stretch of Interstate 19 between Nogales and Tucson, a highway that carries an enormous volume of legitimate commercial traffic alongside the smuggling routes that parallel and intersect with it. The checkpoint is a physical installation with lanes, canopies, inspection areas, and the kind of daily operational rhythm that comes with processing thousands of vehicles. Agents rotate through assignments. Shift patterns change. The dogs are not always present. The number of agents working the lanes at any given time varies with staffing. All of that variability, from the trafficker's perspective, is intelligence worth having, and an agent willing to share it in real time is an asset whose value extends beyond simply waving loads through a lane. Jimenez gave them the dog schedules. He gave them the window when conditions were favorable. He confirmed when loads cleared. He was, in the coordinator's operational language, playing with them. The photograph they sent him before each load vehicle arrived was the clearest expression of the arrangement's operational sophistication. It was not enough to pay Jimenez and trust him to identify the right vehicle by instinct or general description. The coordinators gave him an image of the specific vehicle so that the identification at the checkpoint was unambiguous and instantaneous. The vehicle appears. Jimenez recognizes it from the photograph on his phone. The vehicle clears the lane. There is no uncertainty in that sequence, no possibility that Jimenez waves through the wrong vehicle or misses the right one. The photograph reduced the already small probability of an operational error to something close to zero. It also meant that Jimenez's phone contained, at the time investigators searched it, documentation of specific vehicles that had moved through his lane, a record connecting him directly to the loads he had facilitated. The photograph that was meant to make the operation more reliable became part of the evidence that ended it. 60 kilograms of cocaine, 5 confirmed loads, 4 months, 14 years of service preceding it, 78 months to follow it. The math of the Jimenez case is not complicated. What it describes is a man who made a decision during a 4-month checkpoint assignment that converted a federal career into a federal conviction for a payment he would receive in Mexico after the load vehicle had cleared and he had sent the confirmation message to the coordinators. The coordinators would let him know the money was ready. He would cross into Mexico to collect it. On the other side of the transaction, the cocaine moved north on Interstate 19 toward whatever distribution point was waiting for it in Tucson or Phoenix or beyond. The undercover agents who documented him not asking questions of suspicious vehicle drivers were the last piece the investigation needed before it moved. By October 2024, the case was ready. Jimenez was removed from the checkpoint. His phone was searched. The coordinators' photographs of the load vehicles were on it. The confirmation messages were on it. The pattern was on it. He was 54 years old, and the 14-year career at the Border Patrol was over. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case is a different shape entirely. 2 brothers, both agents, both in uniform, using the vehicles the United States government gave them to run a smuggling ring that operated for over a year before anyone stopped it. Section 5. Raúl and Fidel Villarreal. Before federal investigators moved on his operation, Raúl Villarreal had stood in front of a camera and played the role of a smuggler. The spot was a public service advertisement warning the public about the dangers of human smuggling and casting the Border Patrol's San Diego sector spokesman as the villain was a reasonable choice. He was bilingual, comfortable on camera, and understood the subject thoroughly. What the producers didn't know was exactly how thoroughly. The ring operated for 14 months, running through 2005 and into 2006. It moved Mexican and Brazilian nationals across the border illegally and transported them north in vehicles marked with the green and white livery of the United States Border Patrol. The migrants paid approximately $10,000 per group of 10 to make the crossing, generating revenue that prosecutors estimated at somewhere between $700,000 and over $1 million across the life of the operation. The judge at sentencing put the figure closer to $700,000. The prosecutors put it higher. The gap between those numbers reflects the inherent difficulty of establishing the precise revenue of an enterprise that kept no books and collected cash in a context where every party to the transaction had strong reasons to undercount. Raúl Villarreal had joined the Border Patrol in 1995. He worked initially at the Imperial Beach Station in San Diego County and rose through the agency over the following decade to become the public information officer for the entire San Diego sector, the person whose job it was to communicate the agency's work to the public, to represent its values in media appearances, and to maintain the institutional image of an organization whose credibility depended on the public's trust. His salary in 2005, the year the operation was running at full capacity, was $82,859. That is not a figure that suggests a man being driven by financial desperation. It is a comfortable professional salary for a federal law enforcement officer with a decade of experience and a visible public role. The smuggling operation was not filling a gap. It was generating revenue on top of an already established income at a scale that reflected calculation rather than crisis. His older brother Fidel became a Border Patrol agent in 1998, 3 years after Raúl, and rose through the agency to the rank of supervisor at the Brownfield Station. Fidel's salary in 2005 was $77,803. He was stationed at a different facility from Raúl, supervised other agents, and had built a career inside the same institution his younger brother was using as cover for the operation. Fidel made $77,000 a year as a federal law enforcement supervisor. He was also, according to the surveillance footage that federal investigators eventually collected, the man driving the official Border Patrol vehicle that picked up groups of migrants at the staging areas and transported them north. The federal probe began in May 2005, when an informant passed a tip to agents at the United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement. The tip was specific enough to generate a formal investigation, and the investigation that followed was methodical and patient. Investigators installed cameras in areas where migrants were being dropped off after the crossings. They planted recording devices. They attached tracking instruments to Border Patrol vehicles, allowing them to monitor the movement of specific agency vehicles without the occupants knowing they were being tracked. They deployed surveillance aircraft and followed the ring's operations from the air. The evidence they were accumulating was not the kind that emerges from a single dramatic break in the case. It built across months, layer by layer, connecting specific vehicles to specific routes, specific pickups to specific drop-off points, specific payments to specific individuals in the network. What the surveillance footage captured was unambiguous. Fidel Villarreal, in his official Border Patrol vehicle, pulling up to designated staging areas and loading groups of people who had crossed the border illegally. The vehicle was government property. The uniform was government issue. The authority conveyed by both was the legal authority of a federal law enforcement officer assigned to protect the border. That authority was the mechanism the operation used to move people past whatever secondary obstacles might have caught an ordinary civilian vehicle traveling north with a car full of undocumented migrants. A Border Patrol vehicle is not stopped at interior checkpoints the way civilian vehicles are. An agent in uniform driving north from the border region with people in the vehicle does not trigger the same pattern recognition that would cause another agent to flag the same trip made by a civilian driver. The uniform and the vehicle were not incidental to the operation. They were the operation's primary tool. The network around the brothers extended across the border. They worked with a corrupt Tijuana police officer named Armando Garcia, who functioned as a foot guide and coordinator on the Mexican side of the arrangement, moving migrants to the pickup points where the Villarreal brothers collected them. There were additional drivers and logistics personnel who handled the transport of migrants from the drop-off points deeper into the county. One Brazilian woman told investigators she had paid $12,000 to cross, and that she had been transported in what she described as a police car, driven by a police official who had met her in Tijuana and brought her to the border. Her account placed her inside a law enforcement vehicle, driven by a law enforcement officer, crossing the border as part of a commercial smuggling transaction. The vehicle was real, the uniform was real, the law enforcement officer was real. Everything about the crossing read as legitimate, which was precisely the point. By June 2006, the brothers learned they were the subject of a federal investigation. They did not wait for the case to reach them. Both quit their jobs at the Border Patrol and left for Mexico. The timing of that departure, coming after the investigation, had already been running for more than a year, reflects something about the information environment inside which they were operating. How they learned about the investigation is not something the public record establishes cleanly, but the decision to leave simultaneously, both brothers, after both quitting their federal employment, indicates a coordinated response to specific information rather than a generalized concern. They crossed into Mexico and remained there for 2 years. The investigation did not close. Federal investigators continued building the case while the brothers were in Mexico, and in 2008, both were arrested and subsequently extradited to the United States. The extradition process for law enforcement corruption cases involving individuals who have fled to Mexico is not always straightforward, but the federal resources committed to the case and the documentary evidence already assembled gave prosecutors a strong foundation for extradition proceedings. The brothers came back to face charges of human smuggling, witness tampering, and bribery. They pleaded not guilty. The trial ran for 5 weeks in federal court in San Diego. Armando Garcia, the Tijuana police officer who had served as the foot guide and coordinator on the Mexican side, was tried alongside the brothers. A fourth defendant, Claudia Gonzalez, had pleaded guilty in December 2009 to conspiracy to bring in illegal aliens for financial gain, bribery, and money laundering, and was sentenced in August 2012 to time served, which amounted to 46 months. Garcia was convicted alongside the brothers in August 2012. The prosecution's case rested substantially on two categories of evidence: the surveillance material collected during the investigation, including the tracking data from the Border Patrol vehicles and the camera footage from the drop-off areas, and the testimony of alleged accomplices who had been offered leniency in exchange for cooperation. The defense attacked both categories. Raul Villarreal's attorney argued that the prosecution's witnesses were not credible, that the surveillance yielded no evidence directly implicating his client as the ring's leader, and that the case was built on the inconsistent statements of people with strong personal incentives to shift blame onto the Villarreal brothers. Fidel's attorney echoed those arguments, characterizing the prosecution's case as dependent on two alleged accomplices who had been promised leniency and whose statements had not been consistent throughout the investigation. Both brothers maintained their not guilty pleas through the trial. The jury convicted them on multiple felony counts, including conspiracy to smuggle migrants, money laundering, and receiving bribes from public officials. The sentencing took place in June 2013 before United States District Court Judge John Houston. The judge made clear at sentencing that he intended the sentences to function as a message to other agents who had been entrusted with the protection of the border. He described the operation as disgusting. He said it represented a threat to national security. He noted that the agents had not only violated their oaths, but had used the specific tools of their office, the vehicles, the uniforms, the institutional authority those things conveyed, as the mechanism for committing the crime. The breach was not incidental to the job. It was constructed from the job's materials. Judge Houston sentenced Raul Villarreal to 35 years in federal prison and ordered him to pay a fine of $250,000. Fidel Villarreal received 30 years. The sentences were among the longest handed down to border law enforcement officials in a corruption case. The disparity between the brothers' sentences reflected the difference in their roles as established at trial. Raul was identified as the ring's founder and leader. Fidel was the manager of daily operations. The distinction between starting an enterprise and running its day-to-day logistics translated, in the judge's assessment, to a 5-year difference in prison time. Raul Villarreal was 43 at sentencing. Fidel was 45. Raul had joined the Border Patrol at some point in his mid-20s and had spent a decade becoming the public face of the San Diego sector's outreach efforts before the federal charges ended that career permanently. Fidel had joined 3 years later and risen to a supervisory position before the same outcome. Between them, they had nearly 2 decades of combined federal law enforcement service, and they were now looking at a combined 65 years of federal prison time. Fidel's attorney said an appeal would be filed. The conviction and sentences stood. The practical geography of the operation is worth dwelling on. Camp Pendleton sits between San Diego and the border communities to the south. Interstate 5 runs north through the region, passing through a landscape where the border is simultaneously a legal and physical fact, and a surface that the smuggling economy treats as porous at the practical level. The interior communities of San Diego County, where migrants were delivered after crossing, were roughly 100 miles from the pickup points near the border. A Border Patrol vehicle making that drive is not an unusual sight on those roads. It is a routine presence. The vehicle passes through the landscape with an authority that other vehicles do not carry. That invisibility, the invisibility of the expected, was what Raul and Fidel Villarreal were selling to the migrants who paid them and to the network of coordinators and guides who fed the operation from the Mexican side. The Brazilian nationals who appear in the record of the case add a dimension that is easy to overlook. The operation's clientele was not exclusively Mexican migrants traveling short distances to reach family or work in border communities. It included people who had traveled from South America, who had arranged and paid for passage through a chain of smuggling networks, and who paid $10,000 to $12,000 for the final leg of the journey into the United States. That price reflects the perceived reliability of the service. A crossing facilitated by uniformed Border Patrol agents in official vehicles, regardless of whether the clients understood exactly who they were dealing with, was a crossing that carried a premium because it appeared more secure than the alternatives. The Villarreal brothers were not competing on price. They were competing on the apparent safety of the product. The investigation that caught them was thorough enough to survive a 5-week trial and a vigorous defense attack on witness credibility. It had cameras, aircraft, tracking devices, and months of accumulated surveillance data connecting specific vehicles to specific trips at specific times. That level of investigative infrastructure reflects the seriousness with which federal authorities treated a case involving sitting Border Patrol agents running a commercial smuggling operation using government property. The institutional embarrassment alone was substantial. The Border Patrol had doubled its size in less than a decade in the years preceding the Villarreal case, and the rapid expansion had brought with it questions about the depth and effectiveness of vetting procedures for new hires. The brothers were not recent hires, but the case became part of a larger conversation about what the agency's growth had cost in terms of internal integrity. Raúl Villarreal had made television appearances warning the public about human smuggling. He had stood in front of a camera and played the smuggler for an educational advertisement. When investigators placed cameras at the drop-off points where his operation delivered migrants and tracked the Border Patrol vehicles that made the runs and flew surveillance aircraft over the routes the ring was using, they were documenting something that the public service advertisement, in its way, had been made to prevent. The man in front of the camera and the man in the vehicle were the same man. That is not an irony that softens anything. It is a description of how the operation worked and of what the agency's trust in its own personnel had permitted to continue for 14 months before the informant's tip in May 2005 started the clock on the investigation that eventually brought both brothers back from Mexico in handcuffs. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case moves away from the border entirely, to a military base in West Texas, where an Army private accepted $5,000 to put 8 bullets into a man living quietly in a house on the east side of El Paso, on the orders of an ICE informant who was also a cartel middleman running a hit team out of his own neighborhood. Section 6. Michael Apodaca. On May 15, 2009, Jose Daniel Gonzalez Galeana walked out of his house on a quiet cul-de-sac in East El Paso and was shot 8 times in front of it. He had crossed from Juarez months earlier, settled under an ICE visa, and started cooperating with federal authorities about the Juarez cartel's internal operations. He had cut his ties, or tried to. The man who pulled the trigger was 18 years old, stationed at Fort Bliss, and had been paid $5,000 for the job. Michael Jackson Apodaca was an El Paso native who had joined the Army and was attached to the 11th Air Defense Artillery Brigade at Fort Bliss, the large installation that sprawls across the northeastern edge of the city along the Texas-New Mexico state line. His monthly base pay as a private first class was somewhere around $1,700. The $5,000 he was offered to kill Gonzalez represented nearly 3 times that monthly figure. The Juarez cartel understood the arithmetic of that offer and understood specifically who it would land on. A young soldier at the bottom of the enlisted pay scale, living in his own hometown, embedded in the same cross-border social networks the cartel already operated through, was a person for whom that number carried real weight. Apodaca was not a seasoned criminal being contracted for work in his area of expertise. He was a teenager in a uniform who was offered more money than he earned in a fiscal quarter to drive to the east side of his own city and shoot a man he had never met. The job reached Apodaca through a man named Ruben Rodriguez Dorado, a 30-year-old who occupied one of the more structurally complex positions in the entire case. Rodriguez was a mid-level Juarez cartel member, operating on the American side of the border, whose specialty, as he described it to investigators after his arrest, was coordinating surveillance operations, following intended targets, until the point of their execution in Mexico. That was his professional self-description: surveillance coordination for killings. He was also, at the time he organized the Gonzalez murder, a registered informant for the United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, the same federal institution that had issued Gonzalez his visa and was actively receiving his cooperation about the cartel, was simultaneously receiving information from the man who was building the team to kill him. Rodriguez and Gonzalez shared an ICE handler. Both men were feeding intelligence to the same federal officer, while one of them tracked the other across El Paso to arrange his death. The sequence of events that put Gonzalez in the crosshairs had begun in Mexico in 2008. A Juarez cartel lieutenant known as Pedro the Tiger, Pedro Arana Sanchez, was arrested by Mexican authorities. Shortly afterward, a cartel warehouse was raided. Those two events, a senior member in custody and a logistics facility compromised, focused organizational suspicion on anyone who had known enough about the cartel's operations to have contributed to either outcome. Gonzalez had that kind of knowledge. His sudden disappearance from Juarez in the aftermath sharpened that suspicion considerably. From the cartel's position, a lieutenant who vanishes from Mexico immediately following the arrest of his superior and the raid of a cartel facility is a lieutenant who has made a calculation about which side of the border and which set of relationships now serves him better. The cartel's response was to task Rodriguez with locating Gonzalez on the American side and arranging his death. El Paso Police Chief Greg Allen later stated publicly that Rodriguez had been told to find Gonzalez in the United States by cartel Lieutenant Jesus Aguayo Salas, who ordered and funded the hit from Mexico. Rodriguez tracked Gonzalez methodically. He obtained his license plate number and his cell phone number and used them to establish Gonzalez's address in East El Paso. Investigators later described how Rodriguez and others connected to the operation trailed Gonzalez from one location to another across the city before settling on the house as the site of the killing. The approach was consistent with what Rodriguez described as his professional function inside the organization. He was not improvising in unfamiliar territory. He was applying practiced surveillance methodology to a target who was living in his operational area. Once Gonzalez's location was established, Rodriguez assembled a crew through personal social networks rather than through any formal cartel channel. El Paso Police Lieutenant Alfred Lowe described Rodriguez as the older figure in a loose network of young local people he cultivated through informal social access. He provided locations, occasions, the kind of low-level authority that an experienced adult exercises over teenagers, being pulled gradually toward more serious activity. He recruited Apodaca as the shooter. He recruited a 17-year-old named Christopher Duran to drive the getaway vehicle. A 16-year-old, who turned out to be Rodriguez's own brother-in-law, was paid to conduct surveillance on Gonzalez on the night of the killing, tracking the target and reporting on his movements. The operation had a clear division of labor: a coordinator above, a shooter, a driver, and a lookout below. Apodaca later testified that he had learned about the job through another associate in 2008, who told him Rodriguez was looking to hire someone to kill Gonzalez and would pay $5,000. The figure was confirmed in the charging documents filed after the arrests. Duran received a smaller amount for the getaway driving. The 16-year-old received his own payment for the surveillance work. Aguayo, the cartel lieutenant in Mexico who had ordered the hit, remained beyond immediate American reach after the killing. A capital murder warrant was issued for him, alongside the charges filed against the crew. ICE had known a hit was coming. Before May 15th, the agency had received information indicating that a contract had been ordered against Gonzalez. Agents warned him to leave El Paso. He refused to go. Why he refused is not something the public record resolves with precision. A man who has already uprooted once, established a new residence under a federal visa, and is actively cooperating with a law enforcement agency may have calculated that the institutional protection around him was sufficient, or that relocating again would not ultimately change his exposure, or that whatever cartel reach could find him in El Paso could find him elsewhere. He stayed. On the evening of May 15, 2009, Apodaca was waiting outside the house on Pony Trail Drive with a .45 caliber handgun. He shot Gonzalez 8 times. Duran drove the car away. The 16-year-old had already completed his surveillance work. Rodriguez coordinated from his position above the crew. Gonzalez died at the scene. El Paso police later noted that he was believed to be the first-ranking cartel member killed inside the United States, a distinction that marked the Gonzalez killing as something new in geographic terms. Until that point, the organized violence of the Juarez cartel had been largely contained to the Mexican side of the international boundary. The May 2009 killing represented the cartel reaching across the border to execute a cooperating witness on American soil, using American residents, including an active duty soldier, to carry out the operation. The arrests came in August 2009. Rodriguez and Duran were taken into custody on August 10th. Apodaca was arrested the following day. All three were charged with capital murder and held on $1 million bail each. In the charging documents, Apodaca confirmed to El Paso police investigators that he had fired the shots. He did not dispute his role or the payment. The admission was direct. He had been outside the house, he had the gun, he had pulled the trigger 8 times, and he had been paid $5,000 to do it. A grand jury subsequently indicted all three on capital murder charges. The district attorney indicated that both Apodaca and Rodriguez would face the death penalty. The military's institutional response was careful and limited. Fort Bliss confirmed that Apodaca was stationed at the base and declined to discuss specifics. Army officials reviewing the broader pattern of cartel contacts with Fort Bliss personnel around that period noted that investigators had fielded multiple reports of possible cartel recruitment attempts involving soldiers in the months surrounding the killing, and that the Apodaca case was the one instance in which the recruitment had produced an actual operation. The others were either unsubstantiated or involved soldiers who were approached but did not act. That ratio, one executed case among several attempted contacts, reflected how the cartel approached military recruitment. The approach was not targeted with precision. It was cast broadly across a population the organization already had social access to, looking for the individual whose circumstances and decision-making made the offer viable. Fort Bliss sits on the edge of El Paso. Many of its junior enlisted soldiers are locally sourced, connected through family and neighborhood to communities on both sides of the border. The cartel did not need to locate strangers. It recruited through existing networks, and in Apodaca's case, that network produced a result. Apodaca eventually pleaded guilty. In a Texas capital murder case with a confirmed confession in the record, the physical evidence from the scene consistent with that confession, and eyewitness accounts from other members of the crew, the realistic alternative to a negotiated plea included the death penalty the district attorney had confirmed would be sought. The plea removed that outcome in exchange for a life sentence. On July 25, 2013, an El Paso district court sentenced Michael Apodaca to life in federal prison. He was 22 years old at sentencing, having spent the 4 years since his arrest moving through the court process. His entire adult life, from the night of the killing forward, had been organized around what happened on Pony Trail Drive when he was 18. Duran ultimately pleaded guilty as well and received 20 years. Rodriguez's case took considerably longer to resolve, tangled in a multi-year legal conflict over ICE's refusal to cooperate with the state prosecution. Rodriguez eventually pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to life in prison. Aguayo, who ordered the killing from Mexico, remained the subject of a capital murder warrant, with no public record of extradition or arrest in the years following the case. The $5,000 figure continued to surface in reporting on the case as a specific index of something. Analysts who wrote about cartel recruitment of military personnel in the period following the Apodaca conviction noted the disparity between what the cartel paid the triggerman and what the killing was actually worth to the organization. An ICE informant with Gonzalez's level of inside knowledge, actively cooperating with federal authorities about the cartel's operations, represented a liability that the organization valued eliminating at far more than $5,000. The fee paid to Apodaca reflected the market rate for that specific service in that specific community at that specific moment. An 18-year-old soldier at the bottom of the enlisted pay scale would carry out the killing for $5,000. The cartel identified that price point and paid it, committing no more resources to the transaction than the market required. Gonzalez had been living in El Paso on a visa issued by the same agency whose informant organized his killing. Rodriguez had been registered with that agency as a useful source while building the crew. When El Paso detectives asked ICE for help following the murder, ICE sent them Rodriguez. The institutional architecture surrounding the killing was built entirely from official American frameworks, and the cartel operated inside all of them simultaneously. Apodaca came home from Fort Bliss on the evening of May 15th and drove across his own city to a cul-de-sac on the east side, with a handgun and a $5,000 commitment already in place. He was 18, from El Paso, in uniform. He would spend the rest of his life in a federal prison. The organization that hired him moved on. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Next up, the man who hired Apodaca for that $5,000 hit was himself a registered ICE informant, running cartel assassination logistics out of El Paso while feeding intelligence to the same federal agency whose informant he had just arranged to have killed. Section 7. Ruben Rodriguez Dorado. In the weeks after Jose Daniel Gonzalez Galeana was shot 8 times on a cul-de-sac in East El Paso, local homicide detectives reached out to ICE for help. They needed contacts with inside knowledge of the Juarez cartel's American side operations, someone who understood the organization's personnel and could help identify whoever had ordered the killing. ICE sent them a man who fit that description precisely. He moved in the right circles. He knew the cartel from the inside. He had the kind of operational fluency that investigators working a cartel murder would find genuinely useful. The detectives sat with him. He told them he was the main man in El Paso for the Juarez cartel. He said he was high in the food chain. He told them he would ask around and report back what he found. He never reported back anything. When investigators arrested him 3 months later, the charging documents named him as the person who had assembled the hit team, tracked Gonzalez across the city for weeks, and coordinated the killing down to the surveillance schedule on the night of May 15th. His name was Ruben Rodriguez Dorado. He was 30 years old. He was a registered ICE informant. He was also, according to the grand jury indictment filed against him, a Juarez cartel specialist in coordinating surveillance operations against targets scheduled for execution. Rodriguez was a Mexican citizen living and operating on the American side of the El Paso Ciudad Juarez metropolitan area. The two professional identities he carried were not a case of one being used as cover for the other. Both were active. Both were generating value for the parties on each end of the arrangement. The cartel had in him a coordinator with American residency, social reach into local networks, and the ability to operate in El Paso without generating the kind of attention a cartel operative crossing fresh from Juarez might attract. Zeiss had in him a source with genuine organizational knowledge and active relationships inside the structure it was trying to map and dismantle. Each party believed it was getting useful intelligence from a man who understood the Juarez cartel from the inside. The problem was not that one of those relationships was false. It was that Rodriguez was running both simultaneously and deliberately, using each to sustain and protect the other. His function within the cartel was specific and practiced. When describing his role to investigators after his arrest, Rodriguez characterized his job as coordinating surveillance of intended victims up until the point of their execution in Mexico. That is not peripheral or support-level criminal work. Surveillance coordination for contract killings is the operational core of how a cartel executes its internal violence management. Before a target can be killed, the organization must establish their location, map their daily patterns, identify the moments when they are isolated and accessible, and build a targeting package that a shooter can act on with confidence. Rodriguez had spent his professional life constructing those packages across the river in Juarez. When the cartel tasked him with finding Gonzalez on the American side and arranging his death, he carried those same methods into El Paso and applied them to a new geography with the same practiced efficiency. The full institutional weight of the case only becomes visible when Rodriguez's two registered identities are considered together against the same event. Gonzalez, the man he was sent to kill, was also an ICE informant. Both men had been registered as sources by the same federal agency. Both had the same handler, a federal agent named Loera, who managed both informant relationships from within the El Paso ICE operation. Loera was simultaneously receiving cooperation from Gonzalez about the Juarez cartel's operations and receiving information from Rodriguez about the same organization. At some point in the weeks before May 15, 2009, Loera received intelligence indicating that a contract had been placed on Gonzalez's life. ICE warned Gonzalez to leave El Paso. Gonzalez refused to go. Rodriguez, who shared Loera's contact information and operational relationship with the same agency that had issued Gonzalez his visa, was at that moment finalizing the crew that would carry out the killing the agency had been warned was coming. Rodriguez had tracked Gonzalez methodically before assembling anyone else. He obtained Gonzalez's license plate number and cell phone number and used both to establish the address on Pony Trail Drive, where Gonzalez had settled after crossing into El Paso. El Paso police later reconstructed how Rodriguez and others connected to his crew had followed Gonzalez from one location to another across the city over a period of days before identifying the house as the operational site. The approach reflected the professional methodology Rodriguez had described as his function inside the cartel. He was not improvising in an unfamiliar environment. He was applying a practiced set of skills to a target who happened to be living in his area of operations. The crew Rodriguez assembled was built through personal and family social networks rather than through any formal cartel channel. El Paso Police Lieutenant Alfred Lowe described Rodriguez as the older figure in a loose network of young local people he cultivated through informal social access, providing locations, occasions, and the kind of low-level authority that an experienced adult exercises over teenagers being drawn gradually into more serious criminal involvement. Apodaca was recruited as the shooter. A 17-year-old named Christopher Duran was recruited to drive the getaway vehicle. A 16-year-old, who turned out to be Rodriguez's own brother-in-law, was paid to conduct surveillance on Gonzalez on the night of the killing, tracking the target's movements and reporting them back. The operation had a recognizable division of labor: a coordinator above, a shooter, a driver, and a lookout below, each compensated separately, and each with a limited picture of the full structure around them. The cartel lieutenant, who had ordered and funded the hit from the Mexican side, was Jesus Aguayo Salas. El Paso Police Chief Greg Allen stated publicly that Aguayo had told Rodriguez to find Gonzalez in the United States and that Aguayo had arranged the payment. A capital murder warrant was subsequently issued for Aguayo. He remained beyond American law enforcement's immediate reach. The question of what ICE had known and when became the most consequential and fiercely contested element of what followed the arrests. Rodriguez's defense attorney, Leonard Morales, filed subpoenas seeking ICE testimony and documentation relevant to the case. ICE repeatedly refused to comply. The records Morales eventually received were so heavily redacted that they provided almost no usable information about the agency's management of either informant relationship. 6 government attorneys appeared in the courtroom of an El Paso state judge who acknowledged publicly that he was not certain how to manage a federal agency's sustained institutional resistance to a state murder prosecution. That acknowledgement, from a sitting judge, captured something real about the structural problem the case had created. Federal agencies do not routinely station multiple lawyers in state courtrooms to resist murder investigations. ICE's presence in that volume reflected the agency's calculation of what it stood to lose if the full record of its informant management became publicly available through state court proceedings. What ICE stood to lose was the documented exposure of a specific sequence of institutional failures. The agency had registered an active Juarez cartel assassination coordinator as a productive intelligence source. It had introduced that man to local homicide detectives as a helpful contact in the weeks following the murder he had organized. It had received advance warning that a hit had been ordered against its other informant in the same network and had not prevented that hit. And both informants, the victim and the man who arranged his killing, had shared the same handler. Putting all of that into a public court record through testimony and subpoenaed documents would have established, on the official record of a criminal proceeding, a level of institutional dysfunction that the agency had strong reasons to keep out of public view. Loera eventually testified, after initially refusing and being compelled to appear. He confirmed the critical detail that ICE had possessed advance warning of the contract on Gonzalez's life before May 15. He testified that he had again advised Gonzalez to leave El Paso following that warning, and that Gonzalez had again refused. Loera denied having made any promises to Rodriguez about protecting him from the consequences of his arrest. Rodriguez disputed that denial directly. Rodriguez testified that after the killing, he had met with Loera, and that Loera had told him to cooperate with police if questioned, because Loera would handle whatever followed. The contradiction between those accounts was never definitively resolved in the public record. A handler telling an informant who had just organized a murder to cooperate with police because the handler would manage the outcome would represent something that goes well beyond individual misconduct into a description of an informant management system operating without meaningful institutional boundaries. Whether those words were spoken in the form Rodriguez described them, the broader pattern of the case made clear that the management of both informant relationships had failed at a systemic level before, during, and after the killing. When detectives working the Gonzalez case sat across from Rodriguez in the weeks following the murder, presented to them by ICE as a source with relevant cartel knowledge, and he told them he was the main man in El Paso for the Juarez cartel, he was not constructing a cover story. He was providing an accurate professional biography. The detectives had no reason at that moment to read his self-description as anything other than the cooperative intelligence sharing of a federal source. It took the physical evidence from the scene, Apodaca's eventual statement, and the reconstruction of how the crew had been assembled through Rodriguez's social networks to connect the man who had been introduced as a resource to the murder he had organized. The institutional system that had registered and managed him did not identify its own failure. When the investigation moved toward identifying that failure through legal proceedings, the institution sent lawyers to limit how much of the failure became part of the record. Rodriguez pleaded guilty to murder and was sentenced to life in prison. Christopher Duran, the 17-year-old getaway driver, pleaded guilty to murder and received 20 years. Apodaca, whose life sentence had already been imposed, testified in proceedings related to other defendants, describing how Rodriguez had first approached him about the job through a mutual associate in 2008, how the payment had been confirmed, and how he had called Rodriguez after the shooting to report that it was done. The 16-year-old surveillance operative was handled through juvenile proceedings. Aguayo, who ordered the killing from Mexico, remained the subject of an outstanding capital murder warrant with no public record of extradition. The Rodriguez case produced no meaningful public accounting from ICE. The agency managed its exposure, limited what entered the state court record, and moved through the proceedings without producing the transparent documentation that the prosecution had sought and that the scope of the institutional failure arguably required. What the case left in the public record, assembled from the testimony that did emerge, the charging documents, the contradictory accounts of the handler and the informant, and the basic documented facts of what Rodriguez had done while registered as a federal source, was sufficient to describe the shape of the problem without fully measuring its depth. 2 ICE informants with the same handler, one of them organizing the murder of the other, advance warning received and not acted on effectively. The organizer introduced to homicide detectives as a helpful contact. 6 government attorneys in a state courtroom. A judge admitting uncertainty about how to proceed. Life in prison, eventually, for the man at the center of it. No official accounting for the system that had made him possible. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case leaves the border region entirely and moves to Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where a pilot who had been flying cocaine for the Medellin cartel became the most valuable government witness the DEA had ever developed, before the people who had taught him the trade found him in a parking lot on Airline Highway. Section 8. Barry Seal. By the early 1980s, Barry Seal was earning approximately $500,000 per flight. He was flying cocaine north from Colombia for the Medellin cartel, using a network of remote airstrips and carefully managed flight routes that moved product from South America into the United States at a volume and consistency that made him one of the most valuable logistics assets the cartel had operating on the American side of the business. He was a Baton Rouge native, born July 16, 1939, a pilot of exceptional technical ability who had earned his student certificate at 16 and his private license at 17. He had worked as a commercial airline pilot before the smuggling. He understood aircraft the way a professional musician understands an instrument, at the level of instinct and feel rather than procedure. Pablo Escobar's organization did not recruit pilots who could fly. It recruited pilots who could fly anything, anywhere, at night, at low altitude, without filing a flight plan, through airspace where a wrong decision ended everything. Seal was that kind of pilot. By the time DEA agents caught up with him in Florida in 1983, he had spent years proving it. The arrest came on a cocaine conspiracy charge that carried potential prison time measured in decades rather than years. Seal had been charged before on lesser matters and had navigated them. This was different in scale, and he understood the difference. His response was characteristically direct. He approached the DEA and offered to cooperate, citing the depth of his knowledge of the Medellin cartel's operations as the currency of the deal. The DEA's subsequent assessment of what he actually knew confirmed that currency was real. He understood the cartel's American logistics network from the inside, the airstrips, the routes, the personnel, the financial channels, the organizational relationships that connected the Colombian supply chain to distribution networks inside the United States. A federal prosecutor later described him as the most important witness in the history of the DEA. That description was not promotional language. It reflected what investigators found when they began systematically extracting what Seal had accumulated over years of working at the operational center of the largest cocaine trafficking organization in the world. The cooperation agreement that followed was not a simple informant registration. Seal went undercover for the DEA, while the full weight of his cocaine conspiracy charges remained technically pending over him. He continued flying, now with federal sanction and federal surveillance equipment embedded in his aircraft, running operations that allowed investigators to document the cartel's activities from inside its own logistics chain. One of those operations produced something that reached beyond the DEA's immediate investigative interests into the Reagan administration's foreign policy architecture. In a sting coordinated with federal authorities, SEAL flew a cargo run that was documented with hidden cameras installed in the aircraft. The photographs captured Nicaraguan officials loading cocaine onto his plane. The Reagan administration, which was at that moment engaged in a politically contested effort to support the Contra rebels fighting the Sandinista government in Nicaragua, used those photographs publicly to argue that the Sandinista government was directly involved in drug trafficking. The photographs were released to the press in 1984. The story ran in the Washington Times under a byline that identified SEAL by name and described his role as a government informant. That story effectively ended his operational usefulness as an undercover asset. A cooperating witness whose identity and federal relationship have been published in a national newspaper cannot continue functioning in the role that made him valuable. The DEA's position after the publication was that SEAL's usefulness as an active operative was finished. The federal apparatus that had been protecting him as a working asset shifted into a different mode. The Louisiana United States Attorney's Office, which had been developing its own drug kingpin case against SEAL independently of the DEA's use of him, moved forward with charges. In early 1986, a Baton Rouge federal judge sentenced SEAL to 6 months in a Salvation Army halfway house on Airline Highway as a condition of his probation, requiring him to report there each evening. The sentence was structured around the assumption that a man of SEAL's background and threat profile would be housed at a secure federal facility. The judge's decision to place him in a civilian halfway house with a fixed and publicly known address and a mandatory evening reporting schedule was criticized from multiple directions after what happened next. The Medellin cartel knew exactly where Barry SEAL would be and exactly when he would be there, every night for 6 months. SEAL had spoken about the contract on his life with a directness that suggested he had either made peace with the risk or had concluded that there was no point in pretending it did not exist. He acknowledged to people around him that the cartel wanted him dead. He said he was not worried about it. Whether that was genuine equanimity or a performance of it, the practical reality of his situation was that a man who had been the DEA's most important cartel informant, whose identity had been published, and who was now required to report to a fixed location on a public highway in his hometown every evening, was a man whose protection had been reduced to near zero at the precise moment his exposure was complete. On February 19, 1986, as SEAL returned to the Salvation Army halfway house on Airline Highway for his evening check-in, Colombian assassins hired by the Medellin cartel were waiting in the parking lot. They opened fire on his white Cadillac Fleetwood with a MAC-10 machine gun. 6 of the 45 caliber rounds struck SEAL in the chest, neck, and head. He was 46 years old. The men arrested for the killing were Colombian nationals connected directly to the cartel's enforcement operation. The order for the assassination was traced back to the Ochoa family and others in the Medellin leadership. Fabio Ochoa Vasquez, one of the cartel figures connected to the hit, would eventually serve time in American federal prison on separate drug charges and was released decades later. Pablo Escobar was killed by Colombian security forces in December 1993 on a rooftop in Medellin. None of the organizational leadership that ordered SEAL's killing faced direct American legal accountability for his death. The film American Made, released in 2017 and starring Tom Cruise, presented a version of SEAL's life that reviewers generally characterized as a loose and entertaining riff on the real story rather than a faithful account of it. The film's SEAL is a swaggering adventurer whose escapades unfold with a comedic momentum that softens both the scale of the cocaine operation he ran and the specific institutional failures that contributed to his death. The real SEAL ran logistics for an organization that was flooding American cities with cocaine at the height of the 1980s epidemic. He did so with professional precision across multiple years before his arrest. His cooperation with the DEA was genuine and produced results that extended beyond drug enforcement into geopolitical territory, and the manner of his death was not an unfortunate accident at the end of an otherwise managed situation. It was a foreseeable outcome of decisions made by multiple institutional actors, including the judge who sentenced him to a civilian halfway house, the administration officials who authorized the release of photographs that burned his cover, and the agency that had used him as its most important asset before the political cost of maintaining his protection became inconvenient. The DEA's own language about Seal, as the most important witness in the agency's history, stands as a permanent measure of what was lost when the cartel's assassins found him in that parking lot. Not simply a colorful figure whose story made for good cinema, but a source with the kind of embedded organizational knowledge that federal agencies spend decades trying to develop and almost never successfully penetrate at the level Seal had reached. He was inside the Medellin cartel's logistics operation, at the level where the decisions were made and the routes were designed. The DEA had extracted years of intelligence from that position. When the position was burned by a newspaper story and the institutional protection evaporated, what remained was a man with a fixed address and an evening curfew, and a cartel that had both the resources and the motivation to find him. The Salvation Army halfway house on Airline Highway still stands. The stretch of road it sits on is a commercial strip of the kind that exists on the outskirts of most American mid-sized cities. Motels, fast food, auto shops, the low-rent infrastructure of a city's working edges. In February 1986, it was the most dangerous address in Baton Rouge for one specific person, and everyone who understood the situation knew exactly why. The cartels sent professionals. The job was done in a parking lot, in the evening, when the reporting schedule made Seal's location certain. He had told people he could take the pressure. He said if the contract came, it came. It came on February 19th, 1986, and it was thorough. 6 bullets, a white Cadillac, a parking lot on a commercial strip in his hometown. The most important witness in the history of the DEA died before he finished his probation. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case involves people who made no such deliberate professional entry into criminal enterprise, active-duty United States Marines who began running migrants for cash out of a base 60 miles north of the Mexican border until a Border Patrol agent spotted the wrong car pulling off the wrong highway at the wrong moment. Section 9. The Camp Pendleton Marines. The Border Patrol agent was canvassing a stretch of highway near the California-Mexico border on the morning of July 3, 2019, looking for migrants who had crossed or were in the process of crossing, when he noticed a BMW pulling off the road. What he observed in the next 60 seconds was not complicated. The car stopped. Within a minute, it made a U-turn and began moving in the opposite direction. The agent called it in. A mile up the road, other agents were waiting when the BMW passed, and they pulled it over. The backseat passengers told agents immediately that they were in the country illegally. The driver and the front seat passenger acknowledged they had been smuggling them and handed over their cell phones without significant resistance. The 2 men in the front of the car were Lance Corporal Byron D. Law II and Lance Corporal David J. Salazar Quintero, both assigned to the 1st Battalion, 5th Marine Regiment, 1st Marine Division at Camp Pendleton. The arrest was logged at 10:17 in the morning. By the time the full scope of what those 2 cell phones contained had been worked through by investigators, 16 more Marines would be arrested at the same base during a morning battalion formation in what a division spokesman described as a public display for the entire unit to see. Camp Pendleton sits approximately 60 miles north of the Mexican border on a stretch of the Southern California coast, where Interstate 5 runs directly through the installation on its way toward Los Angeles. The base is one of the largest Marine Corps facilities in the United States, covering more than 125,000 acres of coastal terrain. It is also positioned directly astride one of the most heavily used smuggling corridors in North America. The section of I-5 that cuts through Pendleton is a well-documented route for migrant smuggling operations because it provides the fastest highway connection between the border region and the interior of Los Angeles County. Border Patrol agents have for years routinely found migrants who had crossed or been dropped onto the base itself, moving through the terrain toward the highway. The geography is not incidental to what happened in the summer of 2019. The Marines who became part of the smuggling ring were physically positioned by their assignment at the point where the border's human trafficking corridor and the American highway system intersect most directly. Law and Salazar Quintero had been charged in federal court within days of their July 3 arrest with transportation of unauthorized immigrants for financial gain and aiding and abetting. The migrants in the backseat of the BMW had been picked up at a location approximately 20 miles east of the port of entry at Tecate, about 7 miles north of the actual border. That pickup point was not a location Law or Salazar Quintero had identified themselves. It was a location they had been directed to by whoever was coordinating the smuggling operation on the organizational side. Border Patrol spokesman Theron Francisco described how those coordination arrangements typically worked. The Marines would have been given minimal information, told to go to a specific known location, pick up some people, and bring them to another location. The less each driver knew about the broader operation, the less any individual arrest could compromise the network. The Marines were not the architects of the system. They were the final mile transport layer of an existing smuggling infrastructure, recruited for a specific logistical function because of qualities they possessed that made them nearly invisible to enforcement. Those qualities were the central operational fact of the ring's method. The Marines who participated had closely trimmed hair and a clean-cut appearance. Their vehicles carried Marine Corps stickers and uniform caps on the dashboards. They drove north from the border region, with migrants in their cars looking, to anyone who saw them, like exactly what their documentation said they were. Young American servicemen driving on a highway 60 miles from their base. The demographic profile and the visual markers of military affiliation functioned as a form of cover that no criminal operation could have manufactured more effectively. A smuggling organization trying to move migrants from the border to distribution points in central and northern San Diego County faces its most significant risk in the final overland leg, the portion of the journey where the migrants are in a vehicle on a highway that runs through active Border Patrol enforcement zones. Putting that leg in the hands of Marines driving military-stickered civilian cars removed most of that risk. The cars did not fit the profile that enforcement attention concentrated on. The drivers did not look like smugglers. Border Patrol's own spokesman acknowledged the operational logic. The smugglers chose young drivers who were not from San Diego, who were not familiar with the border region's enforcement patterns, and who made the journey look ordinary. Investigators went through the cell phones Law and Salazar Quintero turned over in the immediate aftermath of the July 3 stop, and the phones produced enough information to map the structure of the operation well beyond the two Marines in the BMW. A senior Marine officer told investigators that the phones contained evidence pointing to other members of the battalion. On July 25, 2019, 22 days after the initial arrest, the Marine Corps conducted its public response. During morning battalion formation, with the full unit assembled, 16 Marines from the 1st Battalion were taken into custody. 2 additional Marines and a Navy corpsman were arrested the same day. 8 other Marines were pulled from the formation for separate questioning about alleged drug offenses. The formation arrest was not a quiet administrative action. It was deliberate theater designed to communicate to every Marine in that unit, and eventually to every Marine in every unit, that the institution had identified a problem inside one of its own battalions and was responding with the kind of visible, formal accountability that military discipline requires. The charges that emerged from the investigation covered a wider range of conduct than the initial smuggling arrests had suggested. 13 Marines were formally charged in total, 5 of them specifically with human smuggling. The remaining 8 faced other charges connected to the operation or to surrounding misconduct, including failure to obey orders, endangerment, drunkenness, larceny, and perjury. The perjury charges suggested that some Marines had been asked about their knowledge of the smuggling activity and had not been truthful. The larceny charges indicated that the operation had generated financial activity that extended into other forms of misconduct within the unit. The charges were brought under the Uniform Code of Military Justice, which governs conduct of service members and operates through the military justice system rather than the civilian federal courts, although Law and Salazar Quintero had already been charged in federal civilian court, given their arrest by Border Patrol off base. One Marine had been charged with smuggling activity dating to May 19th, more than 6 weeks before the BMW stop that exposed the ring. The most recent charges were for incidents as late as July 10th, a week after Law and Salazar Quintero had been arrested. The operation had continued running after the initial arrests, which indicated that the network of Marines involved was not so tightly coordinated that the exposure of 2 members immediately shut the rest of the activity down. It also indicated that the participants had not, in the week following July 3rd, concluded that what happened to Law and Salazar Quintero made continued participation immediately untenable. The ring kept moving migrants north after 2 of its members were sitting in custody. That pattern reflects either a failure of communication among the participants or a calculation on the part of those who kept going that their individual exposure had not yet reached the point of requiring them to stop. What the investigation established about the organizational connection to cartel networks was that the Marines were functioning as contractors within an existing smuggling infrastructure rather than as independent operators who had designed the system themselves. The coordination that directed them to specific pickup points, managed the flow of migrants to those locations, and arranged whatever payment they received came from outside the base. The smuggling apparatus the Marines had been recruited into was a cartel-linked operation that used the Marines as a transportation layer precisely because their profile made that layer the most reliable part of the route. Junior enlisted Marines are paid at the lower end of the military compensation scale. Lance corporals in 2019 earned base pay in the range of approximately $1,800 to $1,900 per month. The per-migrant payment structure that investigators described would have represented meaningful supplemental income for service members at that pay grade, particularly given the speed and apparent low risk of the work as presented to them. The mass arrest during battalion formation produced a rapid institutional response that included the release of most of the detained Marines within days. Of the 16 taken into custody during the July 25 formation, 12 remained in military confinement afterward. The others were released to their commands, pending further proceedings. The Marine Corps' public statements throughout the episode emphasized that none of the arrested or detained Marines had been serving in the official Southwest Border Support Mission, the separate military operation in which troops were assisting Border Patrol with border security functions. That distinction mattered to the institution's public positioning because it separated the smuggling ring from the official border mission and avoided the more damaging narrative of Marines assigned to border enforcement simultaneously participating in border smuggling. The episode generated significant attention in the summer of 2019 and was subsequently examined in depth by investigative journalists who traced the broader pattern of cartel recruitment of military personnel. Those examinations placed the Camp Pendleton case within a documented history of smuggling organizations specifically targeting junior enlisted service members at bases near the border, identifying young soldiers and Marines as a recruitment pool with useful characteristics, legal status, military identification, vehicles that carried institutional credibility, and compensation levels that made supplemental income attractive. The Camp Pendleton ring was not an anomaly in that framing. It was an instance of a recruitment strategy that worked, applied to a battalion whose assignment placed its members 60 miles from the border on the most direct highway route to Los Angeles. The BMW pulled off the highway, and the agent noticed it, and the phones were handed over, and the rest of the battalion came apart in a formation on a July morning. The cartel's transportation layer was gone. The cartel's infrastructure remained. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final case moves away from the checkpoint and the base entirely to the Rio Grande Valley, where the most powerful law enforcement official in Hidalgo County was taking a drug trafficker's cash, depositing it under false names, and letting his son run a task force that raided stash houses and sold the drugs themselves. Section 10. Guadalupe Trevino Tomas Reyes Gonzalez, known throughout the Rio Grande Valley by his nickname El Gallo, ran a drug trafficking organization that federal prosecutors described as responsible for distributing thousands of kilograms of marijuana and hundreds of kilograms of cocaine across South Texas between 2007 and 2013. He was a mid-level trafficker operating in the congested smuggling geography of Hidalgo County, a stretch of the Texas border where the Rio Grande forms the southern boundary, and Interstate 2 connects a chain of small cities that have lived for generations in the economic and social shadow of the crossing points into Tamaulipas. El Gallo's operation needed protection on the American side of the border, the kind of protection that only comes from relationships with the people who control law enforcement in a county. Hidalgo County's law enforcement was controlled by one man. His name was Guadalupe Trevino, and he was the sheriff. Lupe Trevino was 64 years old when federal prosecutors charged him with conspiracy to commit money laundering in 2014. He had spent his career as a law enforcement figure in the Rio Grande Valley, rising to a position that made him the most powerful local law enforcement official in the region. The Hidalgo County Sheriff's Office covered a county of nearly 900,000 people on the Texas-Mexico border, one of the most heavily trafficked smuggling corridors in North America. The sheriff of that county was not a figurehead. He was the operational center of local law enforcement across a jurisdiction where the relationship between official authority and criminal organization had been complicated for so long that the complications had their own local history. Trevino had built a career and a public identity inside that environment, had cultivated a profile as a tough border law enforcement official, and had used that profile to win elections. Between 2011 and 2012, while holding that office and that public identity, he was accepting cash from El Gallo for his re-election campaign. The money did not arrive through any clean or deniable channel. Federal prosecutors established that Trevino received the cash either directly from Gonzalez in person or through his deputy commander, Jose Padilla, who served as an intermediary and who was himself receiving payments from El Gallo in exchange for passing law enforcement intelligence to the trafficking organization. Padilla eventually pleaded guilty to receiving a bribe, admitting that he had provided Gonzalez with information about ongoing law enforcement activities in exchange for cash. The combination of the sheriff taking campaign money and the deputy commander selling intelligence represented a single organization, El Gallo's trafficking network, with purchased access to two different layers of the Hidalgo County Sheriff's Office simultaneously. The sheriff's face was on the campaign materials. The deputy commander's phone was connected to the trafficker. The arrangement covered both the public legitimacy layer and the operational intelligence layer of the law enforcement institution it had compromised. What El Gallo received from the relationship with Padilla included the kind of specific, actionable intelligence that a trafficking organization operating in an actively policed environment values most. On at least one occasion, Padilla warned Gonzalez's people before investigators raided his Weslaco home, allowing the bulk of his stash to be moved before law enforcement arrived. El Gallo also paid members of the Panama Unit, the special drug task force that operated across both Hidalgo County and the city of Mission, to increase patrols near his properties, effectively using the law enforcement presence he was bribing as a security service to protect his operation from other traffickers who might try to steal his product. He was not simply buying protection from arrest. He was buying active law enforcement resources as a component of his business infrastructure, with the people he was paying using their official authority to guard his operation against criminal competition. The Panama Unit occupies the most disturbing layer of the Hidalgo County scandal, and its connection to Lupe Trevino is direct and personal. The task force had been created as a joint interagency operation, drawing from the Hidalgo County Sheriff's Office and the Mission Police Department, designed to operate with flexibility across both jurisdictions. In 2006, Trevino engineered the appointment of his son Jonathan to lead the unit. Jonathan Trevino was 22 years old at the time. He had been out of the police academy for months. His appointment to command a special anti-drug task force at that age, in that position, was the product of his father's authority rather than any established professional credential. Jonathan surrounded himself in the unit with close friends, including the son of the Hidalgo police chief. The Panama Unit became, from that composition, a law enforcement entity whose primary loyalty was to its own membership and to the social network that had produced it, rather than to the institutional functions it was nominally designed to perform. What the Panama Unit actually did between 2010 and December 2012, when the FBI arrested its members, was raid narcotics stash houses and traffic stops and pocket the drugs and cash they found, then sell the stolen contraband to other traffickers for profit. The unit used its law enforcement authority to identify where drugs were being held, gain legal entry to residences and vehicles under the cover of official police action, seize what was there, and move the seized narcotics into the criminal market through a network of buyers who understood what they were purchasing and from whom. The unit was a drug theft and resale operation run by law enforcement officers using official badges, official vehicles, and official tactical equipment as the tools of a criminal enterprise. The people they were robbing were themselves criminals, which meant the victims had limited options for reporting what had happened. The operation was, for a period, what Rolling Stone magazine later described as one of the most efficient drug robbery rings in Texas. A security camera at one of the houses the unit raided captured footage that investigators eventually recovered. The footage showed a man in jeans and a yellow t-shirt with Trevino printed on the back. When investigators working separately on the broader corruption case obtained that footage and showed it to their source at Mission PD, the identification was immediate. "That looks like Lupe's son," the source said. The footage became one of the anchors of the federal investigation into the Panama Unit. Jonathan Trevino was indicted by the FBI in December 2012, along with other unit members. He and 8 other law enforcement officers eventually pleaded guilty. At sentencing, Jonathan told the courtroom he blamed nobody but himself. He thanked federal prosecutors for arresting him and stopping the unit before more damage was done. The judge sentenced him to 17 years in federal prison. Lupe Trevino's public position throughout the period leading up to his own indictment was that he knew nothing of his son's activities or of the corruption inside his department. He maintained that position across multiple public statements and testified to it during proceedings related to other defendants in the Panama Unit case. Investigators found at least one incident that cut against that account. When the sheriff learned about the security camera footage showing his son at one of the raided houses, he questioned the Panama Unit officers himself. Jonathan told him the unit had acted on a legitimate tip. The sheriff accepted that explanation and moved on without triggering the kind of internal accountability review that the footage should have prompted. Whether that represented willful blindness or something more active in nature was a question federal prosecutors continued to examine as the broader investigation widened. In March 2014, Trevino was indicted on money laundering charges connected to the El Gallo payments. He resigned as sheriff 2 weeks later. On April 14, 2014, he pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit money laundering before United States District Judge Micaela Alvarez in McAllen. The plea covered the cash donations he had accepted from Gonzalez in 2011 and 2012, his deposit of that money into bank accounts he controlled under false names, and his participation in an effort to conceal the donations by filing false campaign finance reports. His chief of staff and campaign treasurer, Maria Patricia Medina, pleaded guilty on the same day to misprision of a felony, admitting that she had assisted Trevino in the concealment by falsifying the election records to make it appear the money had been returned. Sentencing came in July 2014. Judge Alvarez described the day as a sad one for Hidalgo County and departed upward from the federal sentencing guidelines, imposing 60 months in federal prison, along with a $60,000 fine and 2 years of supervised release following his sentence. The upward departure from guidelines reflected the judge's assessment that the standard range did not adequately account for the specific harm caused by the corruption of the county's most senior law enforcement official. The investigation had by that point drawn in close to 20 law enforcement officials who had pleaded guilty or been convicted across the various connected cases, spanning the El Gallo bribery network and the Panama unit's criminal operations. A deputy commander had sold intelligence. A son had stolen drugs and sold them. A campaign treasurer had falsified public records. The man at the top of that institution had taken the traffickers' money and put it in bank accounts under false names. The Rio Grande Valley is a region where the border's human geography, its family networks, its economic pressures, and its historical relationship with the official institutions meant to police it have produced a specific and well-documented pattern of institutional vulnerability. Trevino had spent his career operating inside that geography, had understood its dynamics, had used his understanding to build a political identity as the tough law enforcement alternative to the corruption that everyone acknowledged existed around him. The El Gallo money went into accounts under false names. The campaign finance reports were falsified to show it returned. The most powerful law enforcement official in Hidalgo County was running a concealment operation with his own chief of staff, while his son's task force raided stash houses and sold the product to other traffickers, and the deputy commander sold intelligence to the man whose money was quietly sitting in the sheriff's bank accounts. 60 months. A fine of $60,000. The former sheriff of Hidalgo County completed his sentence and was released. Jonathan Trevino served his time and was eventually released to a halfway house. El Gallo received his own sentence. Close to 20 law enforcement officials moved through the federal court process and out the other side. The county elected a new sheriff. The border remained where it had always been, and the organizations that had found their way inside one of the most powerful law enforcement offices in South Texas moved through whatever arrangements came next. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.